In today's conversation, Haley McNamara told me something that every parent in America needs to hear. And that is that Meta and Instagram have something called a 17 strikes policy. And that is that a perpetrator can offend on the app, contacting children 17 times being reported before the account will be taken down. If this makes you angry, good. You need to be angry. That is information. 17, that's not a glitch. That is not an oversight. That is documented policy sourced from deposition testimony, Instagram's own insider. On this episode of Outcry Witness Unspoken, we covered 3 things that every parent needs to hear. 1, why Mark Zuckerberg was personally named on the National Center on Sexual Exploitation's Dirty Dozen list, personally, as a CEO for the first time in history. 2, the 1996 law that has been acting as a shield for big tech so they can avoid any and all accountability to the end users who will be harmed from their deliberate choices to prioritize profit over safety. And 3, what actually changes for parents, children, and survivors if Section 230 is sunsetted in 2027? This conversation is not theoretical. Haley McNamara has been in the room. She has served as an expert witness in the New Mexico trial where the jury just rendered a $375 million verdict against Meta. She is an expert on this topic. If this episode makes you angry, again, I say good. You need this information. Please like and subscribe to this podcast and share with someone you know. These crimes against children and upon survivors are so prevalent that it's estimated almost every child will be a victim. You could change someone's life by simply sharing and subscribing. Thank you. I am JoDee Neil, a former prosecutor, survivor, and author of Outcry Witness, a former prosecutor's guide to healing and justice after sexual violence. You are watching Outcry Witness Unspoken, where we say what the system will not say. Thank you for being here. Hello, and welcome to Outcry Witness Unspoken. My name is JoDee Neil, and I am beyond thrilled to introduce you to my guest today, Ms. Haley McNamara, who is the Executive Director of the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Thank you so much for being here, Haley. You are truly a hero of mine.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and I feel the same about you.
Thank you so much. We are both in a very important and very niche area of effort, aren't we? Tell us about what you do at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation.
Well, our goal really is to end sexual abuse and exploitation, and we think the best way to do that is to try to prevent it from happening in the first place at mass scale. So we do that in 3 ways. We try to hold corporations accountable to have the best practices to prevent, for example, child sexual abuse, sex trafficking, childhood pornography exposure, and more. We also do civil litigation on behalf of survivors against institutions that have enabled their abuse. And we also do bipartisan federal and state public policy, just trying to shift behavior in our country to better prioritize prevention and protection.
This is not a small problem that we're dealing with here. With the rise of technology and artificial intelligence, have you noticed any sort of a data point that can give our viewers the scale of the issue?
Yes, unfortunately, with the rise of AI, there's a number of ways that this overlays on sexual exploitation. One being deep fake sexual abuse imagery. I think about 1 in 7 people, adults, have been targeted with deep fake sexual abuse imagery. We know that deep fake AI child sexual abuse material is on the rise, over 300% increase in the last 18 months or so. And unfortunately, we're also seeing chatbots are being used to sexually abuse children as well. So it really just all of these existing harms that you are so familiar with and speak on are just really amplified with the rise of AI.
Right. And if we just briefly refer to the CDC data that 1 in 4 little girls will be sexually assaulted by 90% known perpetrators before they turn 18, that
Mhm.
data point does not even include the issues you just described, does it?
Exactly. The problem is actually so vast, it's very difficult to find the scale. There's another data point out of Thorn that said 1 in 3 children has an online sexual interaction with a stranger. 1 in 3. That's not even including, that's not sex trafficking, that's not child sexual abuse material. Some of those interactions will go on to escalate to those hands-on crimes. But the scale of this is really quite vast, which is why we cannot, while it's so vital and important to help with people's recovery and healing journeys, we also need to make a change to help prevent some of these numbers from being just so egregious.
Absolutely. Because at their core, specifically the technology assisted child abuse is 100% preventable. Do you agree?
Yes, yes. There is so much more that these companies could be doing. The kind of data that they have on us is pretty remarkable. I was reading recently about some meta platforms, for example. They'll even track when you're feeling insecure in order to better serve you beauty ads, right? So they can track that minute detail, but they can't prevent adults from contacting kids online or from children from seeing explicit or exploitative content. I just don't buy it.
Wow. Wow. Well, before we dig into some of your excellent work as an expert witness, as a hard hitting columnist, I'd like to ask, what is it that drives you to do this work?
I think I just believe that we can do better. I think very often people assume that sexual exploitation is inevitable, and it's not. There's so much of a higher standard we could be holding our society to. And every day I'm just inspired by the survivors that I work alongside, the law enforcement, so many people who just really care and want to be a part of the solution. So I think we're on the winning side of it. There's so many people who want to help on this cause. So that brings me a lot of hope.
Right. And so many of the individuals you just described in law enforcement, I've discovered over time are survivors themselves, which is doubly inspiring.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to talk about how you have come to use your voice in the media. Over the last 10 years, you've been at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, specifically 3 op-eds you've published in April 2025, December 2025, and April of 2026. Tell me what that process has been like for you as you've just taken this bull by the horn.
Well, I think as the more and more you learn about these issues, it is very fascinating. A lot of these op-eds are about tech accountability, about calling for more from these online platforms. And specifically, I've been focusing a lot on Meta recently. They've been in the news, but certainly the same criticism holds true for so many of these companies that they could be doing more. At the end of the day, online platforms are designed. I think that's one of the key things I want people to realize is that all that we see online is a result of design choices. It's a design choice by platforms like Meta or others. What content gets amplified, who can contact who, if children are allowed on their platforms or if they're truly kept off intentionally. Those are choices that these platforms are making. And too often, safety ends up being more of a reactionary concern when there's bad PR versus something that's built in by design.
Overall, how would you sum up the choice that the tech companies are making where it comes to the design and the decision whether or not to serve the population with ad revenue, with their desires, and protect children? How can you simplify that for our viewers?
I think it all comes down to incentives. what are the incentives these companies are faced with every day? They want to make money. They want engagement. They want as many eyeballs on their platform for as long as possible so they can serve them ads and sell their data. And that's where their priority has been. A lot of other industries, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, have regulations in place that require them to balance the incentive for growth or engagement or profit with incentives for consumer or product liability or safety. But the tech industry is particularly unique in that right now there's not a comprehensive safety regulation in our legislation, and the courts have also not very rarely held them liable for failing to prioritize safety. So it's essentially, without the guardrails, their incentive is to just continue doubling down on profit.
Let's talk about the particular law that actually is a shield protecting tech companies from accountability implemented through lawsuits by lawyers like me and others. What is the specific law that is basically the red carpet for tech companies right now?
This is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And as I'm sure you are so aware, this law was passed before the social media of the modern era, over 30 years old. And essentially what started as a bill actually to protect children online had one small carve out for, the good Samaritans who are trying to do their best to protect kids online, that they should have a degree of protections from liability. Supreme Court ended up striking several sections of this bill down. All that remained is Section 230 without any context, which has been overly broadly interpreted by the courts to grant broad immunity from liability for online platforms, for third-party posts, conduct on their platforms. What this law has done, this essential idea that they are immune from liability, is a thesis that these companies have really built their incentives and built their business model on, because they think that they can't be held liable. And so they don't have to prioritize safety. They don't have to prioritize protection. And unfortunately, we have seen for years and years survivors being locked out of the courtroom doors, not able to bring lawsuits against these companies, even when their design choices very specifically and predictably led to sexual exploitation and abuse. And by stopping the ability for that liability for these lawsuits, the public also has yet to fully realize how intentional the choices at these companies have been, because when these lawsuits come out, internal documents come out, and you can see kind of behind the curtain behind this faceless company, the choices that are being made that are facilitating sexual exploitation so often.
Wow. So basically what you've described is a shield, but it's more like a force field where you cannot penetrate it with any type of spear. And in fact, it is one of the most powerful shields that the American government has ever seen. Am I wrong about that?
No, it's so true. No other industry in America has this degree of protection in the law. If you think about any other thriving industry, there are pathways to liability for them. Like the automobile industry is one really good example. They have safety belts, they have airbags, they have rules and regulations, and they have to pass safety inspections. And that's due in large part because there is liability. There is a path for people to sue them when they are negligent. And that is a very standard approach for all industries except big tech. I think that they just were very successful in convincing Congress that they need zero friction and zero questioning of their methods in order for the internet to exist. But just at this point, we have a thriving online ecosystem, and I think that they can survive a little bit of friction as every other industry does.
Amen. What we're seeing now are a couple little friction points on the force field of Section 230 protections for tech companies. Tell me about your experience as an expert witness in the New Mexico trial where the jury just rendered a $475 million verdict against Meta for implementing end-to-end encryption, knowing that it would put our children at risk.
Yes, you described it so well. This is like a first chink in the armor of Section 230. This is the first time that a civil jury trial has been able to hold a social media company like Meta accountable for facilitating or failing to protect children from sexual exploitation on their platform. So I'm glad to play a small part in this trial as I was deposed as a witness, because for years I have sat across the table from Meta executives. We have an annual list called the Dirty Dozen list, where we name 12 mainstream companies or platforms that facilitate sexual abuse and exploitation. And Meta and many of its, subsidiaries, WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, and the like, all have had turns on the Dirty Dozen list, I will say, for those harms. And so there were so many years where we were emailing Meta, we were having conversations with them, bringing them survivor testimonies, bringing them screenshots, explaining, for one example of adult strangers directly contacting children on Instagram direct messages and grooming them into sex trafficking, and calling on Meta to make those improvements. And unfortunately, what I testified to were the facts, which was that while Meta made some improvements over the years, on the whole, they often delayed and were very piecemeal in their approach to these very serious and urgent problems we were bringing to their attention.
Wow. And in fact, you are quoted in the Hill saying 500,000 children every day.
Yes. Yeah. This came out of a Meta researcher, their own internal documents. And when Meta researcher said over 500,000 kids a day were being sexually abused on Meta platforms, only in their English-speaking platforms. That's not even they're a worldwide company. Billions of people are on these platforms. In addition to this, other evidence has come out around Meta recently, like that they have a 17-strike policy for sex traffickers, which is pretty surreal to think about. I don't know if you saw that fact that came out.
I did. And in fact, I saw you talking about this fact, and I was so blown away by your description of this data point that I immediately reached out to the National Center on Sexual Exploitation to ask you to come on this podcast. So that's actually what got my attention. Tell us about this 17-strike policy.
17 strikes. So that means that if there is a sex trafficker out there, someone reports that account for suspected sex trafficking. Maybe they were trying to groom a child via direct message. Maybe their parents saw the account and reported it. That account could be reported up to 16 times for suspected sex trafficking. And it was only on the 17th time, per their internal policy, that they would take significant action on that account. So that's what I understand from their internal documents. And that is so egregious. I think we would all say that kind of a policy, that's not an oversight. That's not an inevitability of exploitation will happen on their platform. To me, that seems like a tolerance for exploitation on their platform.
100%. You put that very nicely. And back to the Section 230 issue, that also protects dating apps like Hinge and Bumble and Match. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It protects dating apps. Even, there have been cases of people who have long records of sexual violence who are on those apps.
Yeah.
Some really disturbing stories there. But yeah, the Section 230 is covering those platforms as well.
And I'm a survivor. I was sexually assaulted by a man I met off Bumble a few years ago, and I reported him to the app. And they said they took him down, but who knows, right? Because we can't discover the back end information on this perpetrator because the company is protected by Section 230.
Hmm. Absolutely. It's
Wow.
so tragic how many people have stories like this who just aren't even able to bring their case to court because of this law. So I am very hopeful that with this New Mexico case, and huge credit to the state attorney
Yeah.
general office in New Mexico for bringing this case, for having a path towards victory. I'm hopeful that there will be more accountability now for these platforms.
Amen. And I love Linda Singer, who is an outside counsel working on that case for the New Mexico AG. She was instrumental in the opioid litigation, working for Motley Rice. Anyways, I could sing her praises. I am also very hopeful about the New Mexico trial because, as you said, it is access to the internal documents that are revealing the true darkness that the tech companies are operating under the cover of.
Hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the Dirty Dozen list. You said a minute ago that you had tried to engage the tech companies. You made recommendations, and they basically fell upon somewhat deaf ears. Maybe you would get a little bit of traction, but nothing like what is needed to protect our children and our own bodies. What was it that made you have the bravery, the courage to put out this Dirty Dozen list?
Well, I think we realized, especially when we first started this, it started in 2013, and everyone opposes, I mean, the vast majority of people oppose sexual abuse and exploitation, but they don't realize the way that it can infiltrate our everyday life or mainstream companies that we use every day so often are facilitating or profiting from it. And people would be outraged if they knew and realized. And so the idea of this list was to name those companies, but also to create a way for individuals to take action. Because if you go to dirtydozenlist.com, you're able to contact the companies within less than 60 seconds. You can send a message to the companies directly and utilize your own consumer demand to call on them to do better. You know, we just want this problem to improve, whether that's by regulation or litigation or the private sector. If the private sector just chooses to respond to the will of the people and put better protections in place, we are thrilled for that to happen. So that's really the goal of the Dirty Dozen list. And I'm grateful to say it's been really effective. We have had policy improvements, again, some often more piecemeal than we would like, considering how urgent of a problem this is. But we have had progress out of Google, out of TikTok, out of Hilton Worldwide, Walmart, many other companies. So to me, the Dirty Dozen list is a great campaign because it does show that individuals using their own voice all adds up and it can move the needle, which to me is very encouraging.
I agree with you. And to your point, issues involving child abuse and sexual exploitation are overwhelmingly nonpartisan and bipartisan. If there's any one area where Americans can agree, it is this one thing. Do you agree?
Yes. Absolutely. It has to be bipartisan. And we're so grateful that in our legislative efforts, it is so bipartisan. There are people who would not want to sit at the same lunch table, but who will work together to help prevent or help rescue or heal people from sexual exploitation. So this is something that also gives me so much hope. It's such a divided time, but this is an issue that people can unite on.
I 100% agree. I say this in my book. People ask me often, do you have hope? And I say, yeah, actually, I do have hope because this is the one thing we agree on. And two, we've never been able to actually communicate with each other about what we've gone through at any other time in history. And now we can. And so I'm finding a beautiful singularity among survivors and advocates for survivors.
Oh, that's incredible to hear. I think it's very true.
So true. So you said that you are done making recommendations to the tech companies. What is your next move here?
We are calling on Congress to sunset Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. I think we've had 30 years of big tech having, again, unprecedented freedom and freedom from regulation. And at this point, it's clear that they have not prioritized the safety of the people. So there is a bipartisan bill that's been introduced in the Senate called Sunset Section 230. And we are hoping that that continues to gain traction. This will likely be a multi-year effort. We're very clear-eyed about that. Big tech is throwing hundreds of millions of dollars into lobbying on Capitol Hill right now, fighting tooth and nail to prevent any kind of regulation or any kind of liability in the courts. So we think that it's time for them to have to face what other industries have to face. They need some basic common sense regulations that are bipartisan and focus on protecting people from sexual exploitation. And they also need to be able to be held liable when they fail to prioritize that.
Yeah, because these are publicly traded companies largely.
Absolutely. And they're so embedded in our society. There's a sense, I think when the internet first began and Section 230 first came out, the internet was so optional, and it's not anymore. You have to be online for work, for education, to stay in touch with family. So at this point, we need these platforms to at least prioritize safety. It seems sometimes I feel like we're asking for such common sense things, it feels almost comical. Just design it with safety in mind. It's like the bare minimum we're asking for.
Right, right. And you said that this bill, the Sunset Section 230 bill, by the way, Section 230, that's 1996, right?
Right.
Okay, I just want to emphasize that the tech companies are hiding behind 1996 legislation, and we're letting them do it.
Mm-hmm.
Who are the champions for the Sunset Section 230 bill?
We've multiple. I know that Senators Blackburn and Blumenthal have been strong proponents of this. I believe Senator Durbin and Grassley. It really is across the aisle. But I would say I think that our representatives do need to hear from their constituents on this issue. I think there's a recognition of the problem of Section 230, but big tech comes in with lobbyists, every other day having meetings, trying to intimidate Congress, telling them that they don't understand how technology works and that if there's liability, that their industry will be sued out of existence, which isn't true. Of course, any litigation would be determined on a case-by-case basis. And so many would be thrown out, a few would prevail, but that would shift the incentives for this industry. But I say again, that's why it is important for constituents to contact your representatives, let them know that you want them to support Sunset Section 230 legislation, and that it's not just big tech lobbyists who care about this, that their actual constituents want big tech to be held accountable.
Amen. And you have tools and resources on your website for constituents. Like if I wanted to share a link after this podcast, do you have one of those feeder links that gets a constituent to their state reps?
Yes. Yeah, we have. It's so simple. You just put in your address and it will connect you with who you need to be emailing. And it will even give you pre-written language, which of course you can edit, but you are free to read that, edit it, send it. It can take less than a minute. And yeah, we're happy to provide those links to you as well.
Thank you. One thing my dad said to me, he was also a trial lawyer many years ago, was that the problem with kids is they got no money and they can't vote. And so as you and I are sitting here talking, it is very clear that the onus is on the parents to fight for their children. How do you make a convincing argument with all the things parents have to deal with today, including inflation and just keeping a roof over their head, that they need to take a minute out of their day to contact their elected representatives?
Parents face such an overwhelming job right now. Sometimes people will say, well, shouldn't the parents just keep their kids safe online? And of course, parents have an important role there, having conversations with their kids. But parents are overwhelmed. That number of apps that come out, the changes in their parental controls. So first of all, I just offer so much empathy to parents and caregivers who are fighting on this issue. But I think that's why it is important for us all to use our voices for legislation and for better corporate practices. Just sending those simple emails is so vital because right now parents are underwater. We need the ecosystem to change. We need to change what the landscape looks like so parents' heads can get above water so that they can do better to protect their kids. And so I would say that that's a really important piece. And I would say also we have been on Capitol Hill at various times, even going with survivors, with law enforcement, with parents. And I met once with a staffer at an office that I won't share which office, but the staffer said, "Where are the parents?" The staffer said, "Big tech lobbyists are here every week, but we never have parents like you come to our door." And that question made me so angry because parents are working. Parents are striving to protect their children. They're overwhelmed. They're fighting the fight on the front lines. So even if you can't get into a plane and go knock on the door of Capitol Hill, they desperately need to hear your voice. So again, I would say just sending an email to your representative or giving them a quick phone call is even better. But those actions are so needed right now because Congress needs to hear from parents and caregivers.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. I want to talk a little bit about the money that big tech is putting into their efforts. I was blown away when I looked at the data that says that big tech outspends the gun lobby by 10 to 1.
10 to 1.
Do you see the difference in lobbyists in Washington? That's where you're based, am I right?
Yes. Yeah, we are in DC and their lobbyists are out in force.
Really?
Uh, there was something, I'm not going to get the exact right number, but there's something like at least 8 big tech lobbyists per every representative on the Hill. There's some stat very similar to that. It's a swarm. And they're all going for a number of different issues, pet projects, but their main goals are, again, to prevent meaningful regulation of their industry or to prevent any liability for their industry. And we've seen that even increase with AI. I know there's at least one $65 million AI super PAC that's tech funded, focused on kind of protectionism for their own industry. So the efforts that we're up against here, I mean, it's a bigger fight than against big tobacco, in the 50s, the amount of money that's flooding the Hill. So, but I would also say I do get some hope from that as well, because they're having to spend that amount of money. They're having to bring that many lobbyists to the Hill just to try to quell the moral rightness that parents and survivors have. I think when representatives are in a room with a big tech lobbyist, it is not as powerful as when they're in a room with a survivor or a parent of someone who has been harmed. And again, that's why I just think we should be outraged at this coordinated effort, but that should lead us to action. Because when we get into the room, our cause is so just and our requests are so common sense and so bipartisan that over and over again, we do find ourselves winning the room.
Right. We just have to get out of our own way. I mean, this is the future of humanity we're talking about. This is basically every child on the planet who will have access to, or a perpetrator will have access to this child that the perpetrator would never have had any other way except through big tech, completely unfettered and unregulated.
Absolutely. If you think about, a predator approaching your child on the playground, you would remove your child. But this is happening, I mean, behind closed doors or on a screen. Sometimes the parent is even in the room with the child when they're being actively groomed or exploited. We're also seeing the rise of sextortion, which blackmail, often for finances or for generating explicit material. And sometimes those cases can escalate to really deadly places even within just a
Yeah.
couple of hours. So, I don't want to scare parents or caregivers about these issues, but it kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning. The scale of these issues is so vast, which is why we can't just put it on parents, why we do need our laws and these corporations to step up.
Right. And, I so appreciate your hopeful uh, position here. But the fact is, as a parent myself, I needed to be scared in
Mm,
order to seize the iPads and trade what I call suspicious silence, right? It's
mhm,
when everything's so peaceful and the children are quiet and you have a minute to check your own social media perhaps after dinner. It's that suspicious silence, which is when the children are vulnerable to predators. And the more
mm.
suspicious silence you have in your home, the more likely it is, if there's a device the child has access to, that the child is being sought after by maybe a guy named Otto on Roblox, which is what happened to
Mm.
my oldest daughter.
Oh, I'm so
So
sorry.
parents need to be scared. This is
Mhm.
a 5 alarm fire.
I know, but it is true. I think parents often also have the idea that it wouldn't happen to my child,
Right.
or self-blame, thinking, well, if I'm a good enough parent, it won't happen to my child, and if it does, then that means that I've done something so, inconceivably wrong. But again, I think that's just why it's these greater forces. I mean, Apple, this is just one example of what parents are up against. Do you know it takes 17 steps to turn all of the parental controls on Apple phones? Like,
Yes,
so
it's a full-time
overwhelming.
job.
It is a full-time job. And think about the kids in our country who don't have the privilege of involved or tech savvy parents or caregivers too,
Right.
right? Like we have to fight for those children too who don't have that. And so again, that's why we do need, taking action at dirtydozenlist.com, or reaching out to your representatives as well. It feels small,
Yeah.
because it can only take a couple of minutes, but it is so impactful.
And one thing I want to make sure I bring up, because Dallas Independent School District relies heavily on the issuance of Microsoft Chromebooks. And I
Mm,
have been appalled at my children's Chromebook search history when I've gone in to look. What? How on earth can Chromebook not figure it out so that my kid isn't on YouTube running searches about things like Viagra?
yeah, that's something so many parents and Chromebooks is actually on our Dirty Dozen list this year
Hmm.
for this reason is that this company is making untold amounts of money selling these devices through schools to kids, and they're not locking them down to be safe enough. If it's being sold as an educational product, it should be locked down to only have access to educational, age appropriate products. There's so many children, like you said, watching YouTube during the day. We've also heard stories of children watching pornography on their school issued laptops at school. And there have even been some cases of kids who were given this school issued laptop, were able to access the open internet, social media, and through that were then groomed and exploited. And so, again, for Google Chromebooks to be putting their products into our schools, into the hands of our young children, they know who the end user is. If you're selling these laptops to schools, you know they're being used by children. Set it up to be safe.
And as a parent, we assume that that's being done. I mean, how is it? How could a school issued technology device ever put my kid at risk? And I can't even sue them.
Mhm.
I mean, there's at least 2 layers of immunity there because the ISD has some, and then tech has some. Well, and then three, Section 230. So
Right.
it's important for parents to know that unless we get this law changed, they're going to be powerless, because I'm contacted by parents pretty often that want to do something about this through the courts. And I have to regrettably inform them that there's nothing I can do.
Yeah, it's the scale of this is so significant and so overwhelming, and I think for parents to know this is so important. Again, we need these companies to do better, but especially if there's school sanctioned tech being given out by your schools, of course, review it yourself, but also talk to your school administrator and see if there's anything additional that they can do to lock those devices down.
Now, I want us to have space to dream, right? If I can dream is an Elvis song that I've always loved, and it just fills me with such hope. If you could dream of having the support of the parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and children in America to get the Sunset Section 230 bill passed, what would it look like?
Oh, well, there would be some lawsuits, and that would be correct. That would be good. The industry needs it, and I think it would shift what the incentives, we talked earlier about this is a problem of incentives. I think it would make these companies build their products with safety in mind from the beginning. Some things that could look like include not allowing adult strangers to contact kids on social media. It seems so simple, but none of these tech companies are doing a good job of preventing that. A stranger should not be able to find your child, should not be able to comment on your child's photos, should not be able to direct message them, should not be able to comment on their live stream, should not be able to try to monetize and ask them for pictures in exchange for funds. Some of these things should be so simple to do. So I think, a world where kids can go online and they're not contacted by strangers, a world where children are not most children right now are being exposed to pornography before the age of 13, and it's accidental. It's not even searching it out. So that should end. And I think these online companies can do that very easily. And I also think sex trafficking advertisements exist online, posts and photos, live streams, especially that de facto advertise victims of sex trafficking for people to purchase, that they would build out very intentional algorithms, AI detection, human review to proactively find and remove those posts and remove the people who are doing it instead of just being reactive, which right now is the majority of their function.
Right, right. Well, if I was going to dream, I remember in 1986 there was something called Hands Across America. And what I would love to see is an effort like Hands Across America, where we all join hands like we did in 1986, which was only 10 years before the Section 230 was passed, and reconnect with each other as human beings for the purpose of preserving the dignity and life forms in our children. And that or a big angry march, because I sure am angry as I sit here and talk to you today. One final question I have is, are there any countries on the planet who are regulating tech well?
I always think more could be done everywhere. There's a lot of really interesting approaches that are coming out. Several countries are keeping kids off of social media by the age of 16. Before the age of 16, I know Australia and other companies are doing that. Some countries are rolling out age verification to prevent childhood exposure to pornography. That's happening in the UK and many others. So there are some good and interesting approaches coming about. I still think, America has an opportunity to be a leader in this space if we take it seriously. And so that's what I would fight for.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think now's the time for us to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, who are we as Americans? And are we going to lead the charge to protect the children of humanity, or are we going to be the first domino to fall? And I am so grateful for the work that you do. You are absolutely the expert witness that you have been offered as in the courtrooms. And I am so honored to have you here today. And I'm just so proud of the work that you do.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for all that you do. And thank you so much for covering these issues. They're dark topics, but again, there is so much hope here. And by you covering them, rallying people for change, I know we're going to look back at this time and be so excited by how far we've come.
You and I will sleep easy at night. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on Outcry Witness Unspoken. I am so grateful to all my listeners and to everyone who helped make this episode possible. These are important issues and we cannot look away. We must take off the rose-colored glasses and accept that unless we take action as parents, relatives, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and children ourselves, our children will become targets to perpetrators. Thank you again, and we will see you next time. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If something in this conversation named something you've been carrying, that recognition is not an accident. You found this show for a reason. If you are ready to take a next step, visit JoDeeNeil.com. Outcry Witness is available now wherever books are sold. If this episode mattered to you, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every share puts this conversation in front of another survivor who may not know yet that they're not alone. Until next time, keep speaking the unspoken.